It was late summer of 2011. I was almost 19 at the time, hanging out with my best friend, who was a couple of years younger than me. We lived in a very rural part of southwestern Virginia, around 15 minutes away from Mount Airy, North Carolina. In this area, pretty much everything closes by 10 p.m., so we had to come up with our own ways to entertain ourselves, but that never really bothered us. We always managed to find something fun to do. The night started off pretty normal. First, we headed to the mall, then cruised around looking for girls, typical things teenage guys would do. When that didn't go anywhere, we decided to hit up the bowling alley until they closed. Afterward, we went to Main Street just before midnight to walk through the back alleys, trying to act like the edgy bad boys we thought we were. But even then, we never felt like we were in any danger since violent crime in the area was almost non-existent. Once we got bored of walking the streets, we decided to grab something to eat at the Waffle House, one of the few places open that late. After eating and making a quick stop at Walmart, we still weren't ready to call it a night. So we started driving around some backcountry roads, which was something we did often. You have to make your own fun around here, and late-night drives were always one of our go-to activities. This particular stretch of road we were on was one I had only driven maybe once before, and that was during the day. It wasn't far from where we lived, but we rarely had a reason to take it. The road started off paved in North Carolina, but after about a mile, it crossed back into Virginia and turned into a dirt road. Like most of the dirt roads around here, the county didn't pay much attention to it because it was so far out and there weren't many houses along it. The road tended to wash out in heavy rains, so you had to drive carefully, and since we weren't too familiar with it, we slowed down to a crawl. While we were both being more cautious, the road didn't seem all that different from others we'd driven on at night. The roads are usually empty around this time, and with only a handful of houses in the area, we figured we wouldn't run into anyone. The road was mostly surrounded by woods and sat at the base of a small mountain. In the dark, it was easy to overlook any houses, but out of the corner of our eyes, we noticed a light. When we looked closer, we saw a man standing under his porch light. We couldn't make out any features, but we could tell he was watching us, standing completely still, except for his head, which followed our car as we passed. We were both a bit on edge, but we tried not to think too much about it. We assumed he was just out having a cigarette, but something about the way he stood there made us uncomfortable. Even though nothing happened with that man, this was only the beginning of our creepy experience. We gradually sped up, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. After a few minutes, we reached the end of the road and were back on a paved road that I was much more familiar with, one I drove about once a week. We turned right, and both of us felt a lot better as we could pick up speed and leave the weirdness behind. This road was one of our favorites because it ran along a mountain ridge, offering beautiful views of the town below. After driving a couple of miles, we reached the end of that road and made another right, heading back toward my house. This road was more wooded, but I knew it well, having driven or ridden it thousands of times before. As we were making our way toward the main highway, something caught our attention in the distance, just at the edge of my headlights. Deer are everywhere around here, so we figured that's what it was and slowed down. But as we got closer, we realized it wasn't a deer. It was much paler than the usual brown of a deer's coat. But we'd seen albino deer before, so we still assumed it was an animal. When we got close enough, we realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a person. They were hunched over, walking in the left lane, facing oncoming traffic as you're supposed to. My friend looked at me and asked, "What the hell is someone doing out here at this time of night?" I looked back at the figure and finally made out the shape of an older woman with long, scraggly gray hair, wearing a white t-shirt and white pants. She kept her back to us until we were about 50 feet away, and then she turned around. That's when we got a clear look at her face. I don't want to say she was on drugs, but that's the kind of look she had. Deep eye sockets, heavy dark bags under her eyes, greasy hair, and her skin looked weathered and aged. She looked like she could be in her mid-40s to late 50s, but it was hard to tell. But the worst part wasn't her face. It was when she raised her hands and started waving them frantically while running toward us. We could now see what looked like dried blood all over her shirt and pants, and she seemed to be holding a large knife in one of her hands. We didn't stick around to find out what she wanted. That desire to be edgy badasses disappeared in an instant. I floored it, and we didn't let up until we reached the highway. We were so freaked out by the whole ordeal that what should have been a quick 5-minute drive to my house turned into a 35-minute detour, just on the off chance that she somehow followed us. In small communities like this, you know just about everyone, but neither of us had ever seen that woman before, and we never saw her again. We kept an eye on the local news, expecting to hear something about a bloody woman being picked up, but nothing ever came up. To this day, I can't explain why she was out there, walking those backcountry roads at almost 4 in the morning, covered in blood and holding a knife, with all the risks of running into wild animals or worse. Fast forward to today. I now live with my wife on that peaceful road on the mountain ridge, between the 2 roads where the incident happened. I drive the same route almost daily, and I've never seen any sign of that strange woman again. But just earlier this year, there was a huge drug and dog-fighting ring busted down the road from where we saw the man watching us. I don't know if it was the same house or if those people were even living there back then, but it makes me wonder if that guy was keeping watch over the place. As for the woman, I just hope I never cross paths with her again. I was driving from Brooklyn to Vermont, heading to my friend John's cabin for a weekend of snowboarding. At the time, I had 2 vehicles, a 2013 BMW 3 Series and a 2006 Ford F-150. I was driving the Ford that night with all my snowboarding gear in the bed of the truck. I was about 45 minutes away from John's cabin, and it was late, around 1 a.m. The roads were pitch black, and it was snowing pretty heavily. I didn't see any other cars on the road at that hour, except for my own. I had just recently gotten my truck back from the mechanic a few weeks prior. I'd had recurring problems with it, and that night was no exception. In the worst possible scenario, on a deserted, dark road, my engine suddenly started overheating, shooting right into the red zone. I slowed down, pulled over to the side, and waited for the engine to cool down. After a while, I tried getting back on the road, but even at a slow speed, the temperature gauge climbed back to red and the engine started overheating again. I had no choice but to pull over again and shut off the truck. I popped the hood and tried to figure out the problem, but it was impossible to diagnose in the dark with the snow falling. I needed to call John, but my T-Mobile reception was non-existent in this area. I couldn't get any signal to call for help. At that moment, I felt completely stranded. I got back into the truck and turned it on again, at least so I could sit in the warmth while it idled. The engine seemed fine while it was just idling, but when I tried to drive again, it immediately overheated. After sitting for about 10 minutes, I finally saw headlights approaching. I turned on my hazard lights, opened my door, and waved my arms to get the driver's attention. The car, a small Toyota, pulled over. The driver rolled his window down, and I thanked him for stopping. I asked if I could borrow his phone since mine had no reception. He asked what was wrong, and I explained that my truck was overheating and undrivable. Then he asked me if I was alone. That question caught me off guard, and I hesitated for a second before saying, "Yeah." He handed me his phone, which still had bars. He was probably a local. I called John and explained the situation. John told me to call a nearby towing company and that he would come to pick me up. I gave him my exact location, and he said he was on his way. After that, I called the towing company John had recommended and arranged for assistance. The entire time I made the calls, the guy in the Toyota just sat there watching me. I tried not to pay too much attention to him, though. Once I was done, I handed his phone back and thanked him again. He simply said, "You're welcome," rolled up his window and drove off into the night. I watched as his taillights disappeared over the hill, and just like that, I was alone again. I got back into my idling truck to stay warm and, out of curiosity, flicked the headlights off to see just how dark it really was outside. When I say it was pitch black, I'm not exaggerating. I couldn't see an inch in front of me. I sat there, waiting and trying to pass the time. With no internet connection, I played games on my phone for about 20 minutes, when suddenly there was a loud bang on my passenger side window. I jumped in my seat and looked over, but I couldn't see who it was. It was too dark, and the headlights didn't illuminate the sides of the truck. I heard a man's voice shouting, begging for help. He was yelling for me to open the door, saying he was freezing. I saw him trying to open the door himself, but thankfully it was locked. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the window, but it didn't help much. All I could make out was a person in a large black coat with a hood pulled over his head. I shouted back, asking what was wrong, and he responded, saying he was lost, stranded, and needed to get out of the cold. Something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I didn't trust him, and I was getting more nervous by the second. Before I could even think of what to say, he started yanking on the door handle more aggressively, pounding on the window even harder, all while still screaming for help. My instincts kicked in, and I decided to listen to my gut. I put the truck in drive, and when he realized what I was doing, he pounded on the window with even more force, trying to break it. I drove off, pushing the truck to 30 miles per hour, even though I knew I was damaging the already overheating engine. But then I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. As I crested the hill, I saw the reflection of taillights parked on the side of the road. As I passed the car, I recognized it. It was the same Toyota from earlier. I slowed down and rolled my window down to see if the driver was inside, but I didn't see anyone. The car looked empty. I glanced behind the car, and my taillights illuminated footprints in the snow leading from the Toyota. That's when it hit me. The man banging on my window was the same guy who had stopped to help earlier. He had been trying to trick me into opening the door, and who knows what his intentions were. I kept driving, not caring about the damage I was doing to the truck's engine. A few minutes later, I saw headlights approaching from the other direction, and I almost shouted with relief when I realized it was the tow truck. I flashed my lights, and the driver pulled over. I got out and told him what had just happened, and he joked that he got there just in time. He asked if the guy had a weapon or anything, but I told him I couldn't tell. "Well, we better do this quick," he said. It took him about 15 minutes to hook up the truck, and during that time, the Toyota never passed us. It was likely the guy had turned around and driven the other way. I used the tow truck driver's phone to call John again and let him know to meet us at the body shop. To wrap up the story, John and I still went snowboarding that weekend, and the body shop fixed the water pump that was causing the overheating. A few weeks later, I sold that truck. I'm glad I didn't roll down my window or unlock my doors that night. In that setting, I could have easily been killed, and no one would have ever known what had happened. I had my first girlfriend when I was 17, and at the time, I lived with my mom because my parents had divorced when I was 11. One day, I asked my girlfriend if she wanted to go out on a date, and she agreed. We both had jobs. I worked at a local grocery store, and she worked at Starbucks. We were both working day shifts, and were also seniors in high school. I chose that day to ask her out because it was a Friday, and we didn't have much homework. After work, I picked her up from her house, and we went to a small restaurant about 10 minutes from where I lived, as it was all I could afford back then. We ate dinner, and afterward, we went back to her place to hang out for a bit. By then, it was already dark. She complained that the date night had felt too short, and I explained that I couldn't take her anywhere else that would cost money. We both decided we'd go on a night drive instead. We drove around town for a while, and then we ended up on a quiet road through the woods. Eventually, the pavement disappeared, and we were driving on a dirt road. I suddenly had to pee really badly, and it turned out she needed to as well, so we pulled over. As soon as we got out of the car, we were hit by an awful, indescribable smell. I shrugged it off, thinking it might have been someone else who had pulled over for the same reason. My girlfriend gagged from how bad it was. I told her we'd pee quickly and get back into the car to head back to town. There was a small, flat area that seemed like the best spot to go, So we did our business and started heading back to the car. But as we were walking back, we heard something snap on our left, like a twig breaking. I thought it might have been an animal, so we rushed to the car. Just as I was about to open the door, I heard a scream, like someone in fear or pain, coming from where we had just gone to pee. I told my girlfriend to get in the car while I went to check it out. She begged me not to, but I thought investigating would make her feel safer. I locked the car doors before I went. As I moved toward the area where we had heard the noise, I heard the scream again. This time, much closer. Suddenly, all my bravery vanished. The scream came from the same direction where we had heard the twig snapping earlier. Instead of going closer, I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and snapped a picture. When the flash went off, I saw a man standing there. He was wearing a white shirt with black stripes, and there was a blue tarp in front of him. He was just standing still. I didn't think twice. I ran straight to the car, unlocked it, jumped in, threw it into drive, and sped off. My girlfriend kept asking what happened because she saw I was clearly freaked out. I told her I'd explain later. We drove back to a busier part of town before heading to her house. Once we were inside and in her room, I finally told her what I saw. The man standing there with the blue tarp. I showed her the picture, and she was just as scared as I was. She let me stay the night since we were both creeped out. Plus it was a Friday, and we didn't have work or school the next day. That was, without a doubt, the scariest experience of my life. We're not in a relationship anymore. I'm 23 now, and she's 22, but we've remained best friends. I was driving home late one night, following my usual route after getting off work. It was around midnight, maybe 12:15 or so. My town is pretty quiet, surrounded by woods, and doesn't have a lot of people or houses. On this particular stretch of road, there's a cornfield on one side and a thick patch of woods on the other. It was midsummer, about 75 degrees, so I had the top down on my convertible. I was cruising along at about 50 miles per hour when I suddenly heard a loud, blood-curdling scream from a woman. It was so loud, but I couldn't tell which side of the road it came from. I hit the brakes hard, bringing my car to a quick stop, and listened. A woman's cry for help was coming from the woods on the left. I quickly got out of the car, grabbing the baton I kept in the back seat for protection. I walked toward the woods, calling out, "Who's there?" Almost immediately, the woman shouted back, "Please, help me." I started running into the woods, pushing branches and bushes out of my way. I yelled for her to keep screaming so I could find her, and every 10 seconds or so, she'd scream, "Help" again. I ran towards the sound, calling back, but something wasn't right. After a few minutes of sprinting, I noticed the woman's cries weren't getting any closer. No matter how fast I ran or how far I went, her screams stayed the same distance away. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly uneasy. This didn't feel right. I stood there, trying to make sense of it, and called out again, "Where are you?" After a few seconds, she screamed, "Help," once more. But it sounded exactly the same. That's when it hit me. I might be walking into some sort of trap. I turned around and started running back in the direction I came, my heart pounding. I could see the flashing headlights of my car through the trees, but even as I got closer, the screams didn't change. They stayed at the same eerie distance, as if the woman was somehow following me. Was I being stalked? I jumped into my car and sped off, completely shaken. I called 911 and reported what had happened, in case the authorities wanted to investigate. I wasn't about to stick around any longer to find out. After telling some friends and family about the bizarre encounter, I tried to put it behind me. But a week later, I saw something on the news that made me sick to my stomach. A woman's body had been found in the woods by a man walking his dog. She was in her 30s, and strangely, there were no signs of foul play. The location where her body was discovered was in the same general area where I had heard those screams. The woods are vast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a coincidence.